Hi guys, KevLar here. In this video we are testing the minimum specs in the Sons of the Forest. As you can see on screen now, we've got the suggested requirements for both the minimum and recommended specs. In this video we're going through the minimum specs. I've built a PC with the Ryzen 3 3300X. It's got 16GB of RAM rather than the 12, as I don't believe many people will have 12, it's usually 8 or 16 or above, but we're also going to be testing it with 8GB, and we have the graphics card, the 1060 3GB. We'll be testing that PC in the game to see exactly how the minimum specs perform. Right, okay, so now onto the settings. So we're going to be playing at 1080p, not changing any of these other specs here. Then on the graphics settings, we've got the options to go low, medium, high, ultra low. We're going to put it on low as these are the minimum specs. I'd expect them to be suitable for a decent FPS in low. I'm also turning off motion blur. That's the only thing out that preset that I'm changing. And then the field of view I'm having on top 95 because I don't like having it lower than that. Let's get into the game and do some testing. Okay, so now we're in the game. You can see the specs in the top left hand corner. We've got our GPU, the 1060, we've got 3GB of VRAM, we've got our CPU, the Ryzen 3 3300X, 16GB of RAM for this first test, and then we've got our FPS counters. So we can see our current FPS, we can see our minimum, our average, our max, and our 1% low. At the moment, we've started off around 40 to 50 FPS on these low settings at 1080p, dipping under 40 in the 30s. This is a bit lower than I was expecting, to be honest. I thought that minimum recommended specs usually are good for 60 FPS at the low settings. We'll try ultra low as well at some point just to see if that drops it. We'll try ultra low also at some point just to see if that increases our FPS. It's still a fairly smooth gameplay here. Around 40 FPS is not looking too bad. And on the low settings, the game still looks great. Interestingly, you see we're using about 14GB of our 16GB RAM. This is a lot more than we were using when I did my test for the recommended specs for the 1080 Ti, the better CPU, and also 16 gigs. We were hanging around about 11 to 12 gigs of RAM. I wonder if, with the lower VRAM on the GPU, we're having to use more of our actual RAM. So I'm a bit concerned that they're recommended for the minimum specs. 12 RAM probably isn't really good enough. We'll be checking later what it looks like with 8 gigs anyway. So on the low settings, we are getting an average of about 40 FPS. Right, let's change the graphics settings. Let's have a go on ultra low and see what we get here. Right, okay, so starting off on the ultra low, I can't see a lot of difference yet. We are still in the 30s. We haven't quite hit 40 yet. Now we're going sort of, yeah, low 40s, chopping this tree. We're getting 40, now 48, creeping up to the 50s, so more mid 40s I'd say. Right, running about in the trees here where there's a lot around. Back down to the low 40s, hitting the 30s as well. So really, yeah, on the ultra low settings it's not made a big difference. Our average has gone up by 1 or 2 FPS, so really it doesn't help a big deal. Right, let's now change it up and see if this can handle it at all on medium settings, see what we get. Okay, instantly you'll see there it's dropped down to under 30 FPS. So we're hanging around the high 20s, low 30s, and this really does feel a lot worse. It really doesn't feel smooth. When I turn left to right I can really feel it juddering a bit. Yeah, this is not a smooth gameplay at all. We're in the mid 30s, but it really doesn't feel nice, it doesn't look nice. Yeah, I'd say that running around on the medium settings really doesn't give us a good feel, doesn't give us a good smooth gameplay, so definitely the minimum specs are for definitely the low to ultra low settings. Right, yeah, so coming to the end of the test on the medium settings. I mean, ignore the average that you see on screen now because I didn't reset that after changing it from low to medium, but I'd say the average on medium is really about 30 FPS. So yeah, in conclusion, with the minimum specs, but with 16 gigs of RAM, Low settings averaging around 40 to 45 FPS, which I'm a bit disappointed with, and even on the ultra low settings it didn't really give us much of an increase. We're now going to do the same test, but we're going to take one stick of RAM out and run it on 8 because the minimum specs they recommended were 12. And I've used 16 here, so I have used more than the minimum specs. I don't have the sticks to make it 12, so we're going to make it 8 and see what impact that has. Okay, so here we are. As you can see now, we've changed the RAM from 16 to 8 gigs. Oh, and immediately it really doesn't feel good. So we've got it on the low settings, and we're averaging low 30 FPS. Whereas on the low settings of the 16 gigs of RAM, we were 40. And this really feels choppy. It really doesn't feel nice at all. Really feeling the frame drops, the dips. As you can see, we've got a really low 1% low there, because we're really getting some horrible drops and dips. Yeah, as we're fighting this mutant, I mean, it makes it even worse. We're sort of going really up and down. We were at 40 at one point, then we go down to 20, and that really is the RAM. It's really struggling to have a nice stable FPS. At 1% low now, down to 5, some really horrible dips. Flipping it to ultra low, let's just see if it makes much difference. I mean, we've had an increase in FPS there. We went above 40 and we're in the high 30s, but it still feels really choppy. Doesn't feel like the smooth 40, 45 we were getting with the 16 gigs of RAM. Yeah, dropping low 30s. Yeah, I conclude that the recommended RAM is important. 8 gigs of RAM really isn't going to cut it. Really does cause quite a horrible gameplay. Let's just stick it to medium just for a laugh, see what happens. Oh, it dipped down to under 20 there. We're in the high 20s and it's even more choppy. This is awful. Yeah, this is not playable at medium. Didn't expect it anyway, because the medium with this setup with the 16 gigs wasn't really that playable either. Okay, so in summary, the minimum specs that were suggested don't perform as well as I expected. I always expect minimum specs that are suggested to give us around 60 FPS, a smooth gameplay at the lowest settings. So the lowest settings, ultra low, with the 16 gigs of RAM, so let's just say the 12, we were getting an average of about 45 FPS. It was playable, it was nice, it still looked nice. So 45 FPS is fine. I think, you know, if you're in the 40s, over 30, it's still an okay smooth gameplay. But definitely don't go down to 8 gigs of RAM. That's really caused some problems. And I have been getting a lot of questions on my review of the system requirements video. I'll link it above there. Questions from people with lower than minimum spec PCs asking if the game will run. So I really wanted to do this test, see how the minimum specs run, so then we can gauge what anything below that's going to get. Now you can see the minimum specs. If you've got anything lower, expect the performance to be lower than that. Anyway, hope you found that useful. Please do give us a like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video. Cheers!